Imagine standing on the edge of a sprawling desert, the horizon shimmering with heat, when suddenly the ground trembles, not from an earthquake, but from the roar of machinery carving out a new future. Welcome to Africa in 2025, where China's pouring billions into roads, railways, and ports, reshaping a continent and, with it, the very fabric of global trade. What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this, China's pledged a staggering $51 billion to Africa, a promise sealed at the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing, with President Xi Jinping himself shaking hands with leaders from 53 African nations. This isn't some distant dream. It's happening today. And it's a story that stretches back decades. A slow burn that's now erupting into a wildfire of economic ambition. So where did this all begin? And why should you care? Let's rewind to the 1990s, a time when Africa was still a footnote in global trade. Its yearly exchange with China clocking in at a modest $10 billion. Back then, the West dominated Africa's narrative. Colonial echoes still lingering in mining towns and trade routes, but China saw something others didn't. Raw potential. Fast forward to 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, cracking open the door to a rules-based global economy, and Africa became a testing ground for its hunger. By 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative launched, a $1 trillion vision to stitch the world together with Chinese steel and ambition, and Africa was a crown jewel. Today, that trade figures ballooned to $282 billion in 2023, with 2024 numbers still climbing as we speak. Picture this. Ships groaning under the weight of cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, oil tankers gliding out of Angola, copper hauls rumbling from Zambia, all headed to Chinese ports, feeding a manufacturing beast that churns out everything from smartphones to electric cars. But it's not just about what Africa sends out, it's what China's bringing in. Cranes tower over Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where a $10 billion Bagamoyo port project promises to dwarf anything the region's seen, while Kenya's Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, a $3.6 billion marvel finished in 2017, now stretches 472 kilometers, cutting travel time from 12 hours to 4. Think of the workers in dusty helmets, the hum of diesel engines, the sparks flying as steel meets steel. These aren't just projects, they're lifelines, stitching nations into China's orbit. Let's zoom out for a second. Africa's got 1.4 billion people, a population exploding faster than anywhere else, projected to hit 2.5 billion by 2050. And China's betting on that. Growth? Why? Because Africa's sitting on 30% of the world's mineral reserves, from lithium for your EV batteries to rare earths powering wind turbines. China knows that whoever controls these resources controls the future. So they've sunk over $300 billion into African infrastructure since 2000, according to the American Enterprise Institute, with 2025 seeing fresh cash injections like Guinea's $270 million lithium plant, set to pump out 1.2 million tons by 2027. Visualize it. Dusty plains transformed into industrial hubs, conveyor belts whirring, ships docking at ports that didn't exist a decade ago. But here's the kicker. This isn't charity. China's playing a long game, and it started small. Back in the early 2000s, trade was lopsided. Africa sent raw goods, China sent cheap textiles. But by 2010, the shift was seismic. Chinese firms like Huawei were wiring Africa's telecoms, building 70% of its 4G networks by 2020, while roads like Ethiopia's Addis Ababa Adama Expressway, a $612 million ribbon of asphalt, opened up landlocked dreams. Now, in 2025, we're seeing the Beijing Action Plan 2025-2027 roll out, promising 1 trillion yuan, 140 billion in trade deals, 30 cross-border projects, and 2,000 health workers to tackle Africa's 94% share of global malaria cases, a staggering 233 million in 2022 per the WHO. This is China saying, "We're here, and we're not leaving." But let's pause. Why Africa? Why now? Think about the timing. Global trade's a chessboard, and China's facing heat. U.S. tariffs spiked 10% on Chinese imports in January 2025, per Reuters, with Trump pushing 25% on steel and autos just this month. Meanwhile, Europe's cozying up to Canada, and India's eyeing Africa's mines. China's not just investing, it's fortifying. Take Djibouti, a tiny nation on the Horn of Africa. China's $590 million naval base there, opened in 2017, now oversees a trade choke point where 10% of the world's oil flows. So when you see freighters stacked with containers gliding through the Red Sea, know China's got eyes on it. Back on land, Nigeria's Lekki deep sea port, a $1.5 billion giant operational since 2023, handles 1.2 million containers a year, dwarfing anything West Africa's built. Picture the cranes swinging, the horns blaring, the sheer scale of it. This is China's footprint, and it's growing. But let's ground this in history. Africa's no stranger to foreign hands. France and Britain carved it up in the 1880s, leaving scars still visible in borders and rail lines. But China's approach is different. No colonies, no flags, just contracts. By 2020, over 10,000 Chinese firms operated in Africa, employing 325,000 locals across 643 projects, says Johns Hopkins SAIS. So why does it feel like a takeover? Because the numbers don't lie. Africa's exports to China jumped 35% between 2018 and 2023, hitting $167 billion, while imports from China, think machinery, phones, solar panels, rose to $115 billion. Yet the balance tilts. 89% of Africa's exports are raw materials, per UNCTAD, while 94% of China's are finished goods. This isn't trade, it's a pipeline. So as we stand here in 2025, what's the vibe? Walk through Lusaka, Zambia, and you'll see Chinese signs on storefronts, hear Mandarin in boardrooms. In South Africa, 15 billion in deals since 2018 have miners grumbling about Beijing's grip. Meanwhile, Egypt's hosting Kingdom Holdings, a Chinese linen giant, building a plant to tap the Suez Canal's trade flow. Visualize it. Cotton fields buzzing with workers, ships threading through the canal, all feeding China's machine. But here's where it gets dicey. Debt. Africa's borrowed $153 billion from China since 2000, says the Global Development Policy Center, with nations like Angola owing $21 billion by 2023. Repayments loom, and whispers of debt traps echo. Yet China's not blinking. February 2025 saw Foreign Minister Wang Yi tour the continent, inking pacts from Morocco to Mozambique. So ask yourself, is this partnership or predation? What's China really after? And what happens when Africa pushes back? That's where this story's heading. And trust me, you won't believe what's coming next. So we've set the stage. China's got its hooks deep in Africa, with billions flowing into ports, railways, and mines. But now, let's peel back the curtain and see what's really going on. Imagine a map of Africa lighting up. Every glowing, dotted Chinese project, from Morocco's wind farms to South Africa's steel mills. This isn't just about building stuff. It's about control. Let's start with the numbers. In 2023, 89% of Africa's exports to China were raw materials. Think oil from Nigeria, copper from Zambia, cobalt from the DRC, while 94% of what China shipped back was manufactured goods, everything from solar panels to smartphones. That's not a partnership, that's a conveyor belt. Africa's digging up its future and handing it over, while China's factories hum, spitting out finished products that flood African markets. Take the Democratic Republic of Congo, home to 60% of the world's cobalt, a metal powering your Tesla and iPhone. In 2024, China controlled 15 of the DRC's 19 cobalt mines, producing 110,000 tons, according to the Cobalt Institute. That's enough to make batteries for 5 million electric vehicles, all locked into China's supply chain. Meanwhile, the DRC's trade deficit with China hit $6 billion last year, a gap that's only growing. Visualize it. Miners in dusty pits, hauling up blue-green ore while ships sail off to Shenzhen, leaving behind a few bucks and a mountain of debt. But it's not just minerals. Energy's the next frontier. China's State Power Investment Co. broke ground in January 2025 on a $1.2 billion solar farm in Algeria, aiming for 800 megawatts by 2027, enough to power 300,000 homes. Reuters reported it as the largest renewable push in North Africa yet. But here's the catch. 70% of the panels come from Chinese firms like Jinko Solar, and the profits flow back east. Fossil fuels still dominate, though. Angola's pumping 1.1 million barrels of oil a day, with 25% going to China, locking in $12 billion in deals since 2020. So why's this matter? Because China's not just buying, it's building the arteries. Take the $4.5 billion Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, finished in 2018. 672 kilometers of track linking Ethiopia's highlands to the Red Sea, moving 3 million tons of goods a year. It's Ethiopia's lifeline, but China financed 70% of it. And when repayments lagged, Beijing renegotiated in 2024, extending terms but hiking interest to 3.5%. Now picture Kenya, where the standard gauge railway's $3.6 billion tab left taxpayers groaning. By 2023, Kenya owed China $5.9 billion, with $560 million due yearly. Per the World Bank, that's 12% of its budget, siphoned off to service a debt that built a train most locals can't afford to ride. Let's zoom in on a fresh twist. Guinea's Simandu iron ore project. A $15 billion monster kicking off in 2025. China's Chinalco and Rio Tinto are sinking $6 billion into a 650-kilometer railway to haul 120 million tons of ore a year. Bloomberg says it'll double Guinea's GDP by 2030. But here's the rub. 85% of that ore is earmarked for Chinese steel mills, and Guinea's locked into a 35-year supply deal. Imagine the dust clouds rising as trains rumble through jungle, all to feed China's blast furnaces. So what's Africa getting out of this? Jobs. Sure, 643. Chinese projects employed 325,000 Africans by 2023, says Johns Hopkins SAIS. But wages hover at $2 a day in places like Zimbabwe's mines, where unions in 2025 protested slave-like conditions under China National Building Material Co. Meanwhile, tech's booming. Huawei's wired 70% of Africa's 5G networks, rolling out 1,500 base stations in Nigeria alone by February 2025, per TechCrunch. But locals whisper about data harvesting, with Kenya's Daily Nation reporting in January that Chinese-built smart cities in Nairobi might double as surveillance hubs. Controversies brewing elsewhere. Zambia's Copper Belt saw riots in 2024 when China Non-Ferrous Metal Mining Co. laid off 200 workers, sparking a strike that shut down 10% of output. Then there's Chad, where oil fields tied to China National Petroleum Corpers hit a snag in 2025. Locals torched a rig after a spill poisoned 50 miles of farmland. Per Al Jazeera, China's response, send in negotiators with $10 million in aid, but the damage lingers. So here's the midway punch. Stick around. This next twist could flip the script on who's really winning. Because Africa's not sitting still. South Africa's courting Tesla for a gigafactory, offering tax breaks China can't match, while India's sniffing around the DRC's lithium, pledging $500 million in 2025 to counter Beijing. Meanwhile, the African Union's pushing a continental rating agency, launched in 2024 with Moody's backing, to rethink debt terms. Could this break China's grip? Let's dig deeper. Trade deficits tell a brutal story. Africa's $47 billion shortfall with China in 2023 ballooned to $52 billion in 2024, per UNCTAD. Why? Because African nations export cheap and import dear. Ghana's cocoa fetches $2,500 a ton, but a Chinese-made excavator costs $100,000. Multiply that across 54 countries, and you've got a hemorrhage. Yet China's doubling down. February 2025 saw Foreign Minister Wang Yi hit the continent, signing off on $3 billion in soft loans for Senegal's Dakar port. Visualize it. Cranes swinging, ships unloading, a shiny new terminal. But the fine print's a killer. 20% interest over 15 years. Then there's Egypt, where China's pumping $850 million into the Suez Canal economic zone, targeting textile exports. Kingdom Holdings broke ground in January 2025, aiming for 100,000 jobs, but 60% of the cotton sourced from Xinjiang, raising eyebrows about forced labor ties. So what's the play? China's securing Africa as a resource vault and a market. By 2024, Chinese firms held $150 billion in foreign direct investment stock, per the American Enterprise Institute, with 2025 adding $10 billion more. Think of it. Every dam, every highway, every phone tower's a chess move. But cracks are showing. Morocco's phosphate giant OCP snubbed China in 2025, inking a $7 billion fertilizer deal with Brazil instead. Meanwhile, the EU's dangling $320 million for Namibia's green hydrogen, a bid to peel it from Beijing's orbit. Visualize the tug of war. African leaders at podiums, juggling offers, while ports hum with Chinese ships. So as we barrel toward the end, ask yourself, is Africa a pawn or a player? Because what's coming next might just blow this wide open. So here we are, standing at the edge of a seismic shift. China's poured billions into Africa, turning deserts into industrial hubs, jungles into rail networks, and ports into gateways. But as the dust settles in 2025, something unexpected's brewing. Let's pull the lens back. By February 24, 2025, the Beijing Action Plan 2025 to 2027 is in full swing, with China promising 30 cross-border projects, from a $2.1 billion bridge linking Cameroon to Chad to a $900 million power grid tying Ghana to Burkina Faso. Visualize it. Steel beams rising over rivers, workers in hard hats stringing cables across savannas. This is China's vision of a connected Africa, a continent stitched into its economic web. But here's the twist. Africa's not just nodding along. Whispers of a new African rating agency, launched in 2024 with $50 million from the African Development Bank, are getting louder. By January 2025, it's graded $30 billion in Chinese loans, flagging 15% as high risk for repayment, per Bloomberg. This isn't just paperwork, it's a power play. Imagine finance ministers in Addis Ababa poring over spreadsheets, ready to renegotiate terms. Could this be the crack in China's armor? Let's zoom in on Namibia, where a wild card's flipping the game. China's got $1.5 billion in its Atlantic ports, handling 2 million tons of cargo a year. But in February 2025, the EU swoops in with a $320 million green hydrogen deal aiming to produce 250,000 tons by 2028. Reuters says it's a direct jab at China's fossil fuel dominance, which still accounts for 85% of its African energy investments. Picture the scene. Wind turbines spinning, hydrogen tanks gleaming, all while Chinese oil rigs grumble nearby. Then there's Chad, where that oil field spill from Part 2's escalated. By early 2025, local militias seized 2 Chinese rigs, demanding $100 million in reparations. China's response: a $15 million payout and a promise of 500 jobs, but the damage is done. Al Jazeera reports exports dropped 20% in January, a $200 million hit. So what's this mean? Africa's waking up. Take South Africa. Tesla's sniffing around for a $2 billion gigafactory, lured by 2025 tax breaks that shaved 10% off corporate rates. China's got $15 billion in mining deals there, but Pretoria's playing both sides. Meanwhile, India's making waves. Its $500 million lithium bid in the DRC, confirmed by the Economic Times in February 2025, aims to snag 10% of output. A lifeline for its EV push. Visualize the chessboard. Diplomats jetting between capitals, contracts flying, while China's $1 trillion plus capital export since 2000 looms large. But here's the bombshell. A leaked U.S. intelligence brief, flagged by the FBI in January 2025, ties China to a $1.1 billion arms deal probe in Libya. Small arms and drones, funneled through a Chinese firm in Sudan, allegedly to secure oil leases. It's unverified, but the Council on Foreign Relations says it's got Washington scrambling. Imagine the headlines. China's trade mask slips. If true, this isn't just investment, it's leverage. So let's crunch some final numbers. Africa's borrowed $153 billion from China since 2000, with $60 billion still outstanding in 2025, per the Global Development Policy Center. Angola's $21 billion debt's a poster child, eating 40% of its oil revenue yearly. Yet China's not slowing. February 2025 saw a $3 billion loan to Senegal's Dakar port. With a catch, 20% of profits go to China Harbor Engineering Co. boss for 25 years. Then there's Egypt's Suez textile boom. Kingdom Holdings' $850 million plant hit 50% capacity in January, churning out linen for Europe. But 60% of its cotton's Xinjiang-sourced, sparking boycotts in France. So what's the score? China's locked in $150 billion in foreign direct investment stock by 2024, with 2025 piling on $10 billion more. But renewables are creeping up. 8% of energy projects now, like Algeria's solar farm, hint at a greener pivot. Still, fossil fuels rule, with 62% of Africa's exports to China oil and gas, per UNCTAD. Here's the gut punch. Africa's $52 billion trade deficit with China in 2024 is projected to hit $60 billion by year-end. LSE Blogs calls it China addiction. Raw goods out, finished goods in, debt piling up. So picture this. A Tanzanian farmer buys a $200 Chinese tractor, but his coffee fetches $1 a pound. Multiply that by 1 billion people, and you've got a continent tethered. Yet resistance flickers. Morocco's $7 billion fertilizer deal with Brazil in 2025 snubbed China's phosphates. Nigeria's flirting with Japan for a $1 billion rail revamp. Visualize the pushback. Protests in Lusaka. Boardrooms in Lagos. A slow unraveling. But here's the final twist. China's not just securing trade, it's securing power. Djibouti's naval base now hosts 2,000 troops, guarding 10% of global oil flows. Namibia's ports could pivot Beijing's way if the EU blinks. Chad's minerals might lock into China's orbit if debts deepen. So, as we close, think about this. Africa's got 17% of the world's people, 30% of its minerals, and a $3 trillion GDP by 2025. China's bet is clear. But who's really winning? Is this a lifeline, lifting nations out of poverty, or a leash, tying them to Beijing's whims? I'll leave you with this. Last week, February 17th, 2025, Kenya's parliament debated a bill to cap foreign ownership of mines at 49%. If it passes, China's $10 billion stake there's at risk. So tell me in the comments, is this partnership or predation? What's Africa's next move? And what happens when the bill comes due?